Okay, so still it, and he means the idea of the corpse here. Richard is talking about the idea of the farmer's corpse, the corpse of the first murder. So still it, the corpse, seemed relatively harmless. Yeah, Richard is explaining how for him this first murder was not actually very... It didn't bother him so much. It didn't bother him as much as you might expect. And so even the idea of the farmer's corpse seemed relatively harmless. Relatively means fairly, and it works very well with harmless. Yeah, this seemed relatively harmless and very similar to fairly. Yeah, it was fairly harmless, it was relatively harmless. So Henry talks about poison a bit later. He's talking about mushrooms, poisonous mushrooms, but he also talks about Italian poisons, and he calls them the Italian comfortives. I'm not sure which poisons he is referring to, but he says not like the Italian comfortives, which are relatively quick and kind. So these poisons, these Italian poisons, they kill the person quickly and perhaps painlessly, and that's perhaps why he says quick and kind. Yeah, they work quickly and painlessly. The person doesn't suffer very much, and so perhaps the Italian poisons are the better type of poison to use. Okay, and now we get another one with relatively. Bunny, who had been relatively calm, yeah, fairly calm, relatively calm, was now on a rampage. Now, if someone is on a rampage or on the rampage, you sometimes see there, he's on a rampage, he's on the rampage, both possible, both correct. That means that you are really angry and you are taking your anger out on everybody around you. Yeah, you're being angry and bad-tempered with everybody around you because you are in a terrible mood. So you are on the rampage. Okay, so yeah, so Bunny, of course, is on the rampage because he's so angry about being excluded from the group. He's so upset. Yeah, he's terribly upset. He's awfully upset about being excluded from the group, and that's why he is on the rampage. And Bunny was actually a wildly erratic character. Yeah, this wildly is a very common adverb, and we tend to use it with negative prefixes. Wildly inaccurate figures, wildly unrealistic predictions, wildly implausible explanations, something like that. Wildly implausible, wildly unrealistic, wildly inaccurate, and wildly erratic. Now, I know erratic is not a negative prefix, it doesn't have a negative prefix, but if somebody is erratic, then they're unpredictable. In other words, they're wild. And so wildly erratic works very well. You could also say he's wildly unpredictable, but notice that unpredictable is un. It does have a negative prefix. So wildly is often used with negative prefixes. And by the way, if you're ever unsure if an adverb collocation works, you have two options. You can look on Google Ngrams and you can find out very quickly how often your collocation is used in literature, in books, and I use Google Ngrams a lot to check that my thoughts about something, how common some collocation is, to check that my thoughts are correct, because I might be incorrect, yeah? So that's one thing you can do. But the second thing is you can ask on the discussion or on the Q&A of this class, put your collocation in the discussion and ask me, is this a common collocation? And I'll tell you what I think. But please do use Google Ngrams as well. It's even better than me. Okay, so ominous changes. And remember, ominous means it's related to the word omen. Omen, yeah, a bad omen, a good omen. You know, a black cat might be a bad omen, which means a bad sign. It tells you that something bad will happen in the future. It predicts, it foretells something bad will happen in the future. And ominous changes sounds like changes which are full of bad possibilities that might happen in the future. Yeah, so an ominous change is not a good change. It's something that might lead to something bad. So ominous changes were taking place, changes of which I was dimly aware. Now, you remember in the last class we had dimly aware. Okay, so that's one to note down because it crops up quite often. We had it in a different sentence in the previous class, but we had it twice in chapter 5. So that tells you that that is a really common collocation, dimly aware. And I also want you to notice that we've got ominous changes, that's a noun, were taking place, changes, notice the repetition of the noun changes, changes, which is of course an apositive. It's a repeated apositive where we've got changes, changes, and notice that this apositive doesn't have the two noun phrases right next to each other. This changes is the subject to the verb, and this changes is renaming the first changes, changes of which I was dimly aware. Okay, so first got ominous changes, changes of which I was dimly aware were taking place. Okay, and so that is an apositive. It's a repeated apositive. I like to repeat old grammar, old vocabulary, so that you don't forget apositives, because really all writers use these kind of tricks of the trade. Yeah, they're using apositives, they're using absolute phrases, and they are putting different phrases and clauses in different interesting positions. So keep an eye out for all of the little tricks that Donna Tartt is using, because she's a great writer. Now we find out that Bunny floundered aimlessly. And if you flounder, then you move in a very difficult or clumsy or awkward way. But you can actually say the marriage floundered as well, which means it went through a difficult, clumsy period. Yeah, and so if your marriage is floundering, it sounds like you might be getting a divorce soon. Your marriage is on the rocks, we say, on the rocks. Your marriage is floundering. But Bunny was floundering aimlessly, and it was talking about his movement here, that he was moving in a clumsy, difficult, awkward way. And you can also wander aimlessly. You know, if you are wandering the streets aimlessly, that means that you don't have any particular destination that you're going to. You are just going for a walk. You're wandering aimlessly. Okay? Now, aside from the barely perceptible strain, which manifested itself in all dealings with Bunny, things were going smoothly. And that's an adverb collocation as well, really. But let's focus on barely perceptible first. If something is barely perceptible, it's not very perceptible. It's almost imperceptible. It's virtually imperceptible. Okay, so barely perceptible and virtually imperceptible, they are more or less the same. Yeah, because you can't really see this strain. It's almost invisible. It's virtually invisible. This strain, this tension, which manifested itself in all dealings with Bunny. Of course, every time they see Bunny, he's goading them. You remember this word goad, yeah? When you goad somebody, you tease them to make them really angry, to make them really annoyed. And he is goading all of his friends. He has found their weak points, and he is needling them. Yeah, he is teasing them. He's goading them. He's trying to make them scared and angry. And so, aside from that tension, which was always there anytime they saw Bunny, things were going smoothly. Now, we use this all the time. If things are going smoothly, they're going well. Yeah, and so I hope in your life, work is going smoothly, because that means things are going well. I hope your financial situation is going smoothly, because this is a time when inflation is going through the roof and everybody is struggling to make ends meet. So I really hope that your financial situation is going smoothly. Now, Bunny, I think this is Bunny. No, maybe it's Henry. Henry said, looking up at me blankly. So if you look at someone with a blank expression on your face, it sounds as though it's totally without emotion. A blank face is an empty face. It's without emotion. A blank sheet of paper has no writing on it. It's completely plain. Nobody has written or drawn anything on that paper yet. And a blank face, a blank expression, is a face without emotion. And so Henry often, I think, speaks without much emotion. I think he's not a very emotional person. And so Henry said, looking up at Richard blankly, with a blank expression on his face, with a vacant expression on his face. And you could say vacantly. Henry said, looking up at Richard vacantly. So vacantly is exactly the same as blankly. And gormlessly, I think, is similar, but gormlessly sounds a bit stupid as well. It sounds like blank and stupid. Not just vacant, not just blank, but also a bit dumb, a bit stupid. So that is very negative. That's more insulting, gormlessly, whereas blankly and vacantly aren't insulting. Okay, you can sit down heavily, which just means it looks like you sat down fast and furiously. Yeah, furiously. You sat down very quickly, and it sounds heavy. Yeah, it sounds like you made a loud noise when you hit the chair. So you sit down heavily. Now, somebody, I think it was Richard. Richard heard distinctly the peculiar huffing sound of Bunny's snores. Snore is, of course, unfortunately, I snore. My wife tells me that I snore heavily. Yeah, you can snore heavily. And I know that because she sometimes isn't there in the morning. She's had enough of my heavy snoring. And yeah, so you can actually say, I distinctly heard, or I heard distinctly. That distinctly can go before it or after it. I heard distinctly the peculiar huffing sound, or I distinctly heard the peculiar huffing sound. Both work. And this distinctly works very well with remember. I distinctly remember, or I remember distinctly. It seems to work both sides of remember as well. And remember that remember distinctly is the opposite of vaguely remember. I vaguely remember. Yeah, vaguely with remember is the opposite of distinctly. It's when you only have an unclear memory of something, then you vaguely remember. You kind of remember. You partially remember. I vaguely remember, but distinctly remember. You remember 100%. You remember perfectly, clearly. Okay, so Bunny would become inexplicably enraged if Charles offered to buy him an ice cream. Yeah, so inexplicably means without explanation. Yeah, without explanation, Bunny would become enraged, furious, angry again. Yeah, inexplicably enraged. Okay, so inexplicably works very well with enraged. Inexplicably enraged. Next, I was dreadfully flustered, embarrassed. Yeah, I think this is after Francis made a pass at Richard, which just means he tried to chat Richard up, or maybe not even chat him up, but I think he touched his face or something like that. And Richard was embarrassed. He was flustered. Yeah, this wasn't what he wanted. And so he was dreadfully flustered, dreadfully embarrassed. Dreadfully works with both of those. Yeah, I think you could say terribly flustered, awfully flustered as well. Okay, these crackpot prejudices. Make sure you know this word, prejudices. Your prejudices are your preformed opinions about different groups of people. And very often we use the word prejudices very often for preformed opinions which are unfair. Yeah, and so if you don't like a particular group of people, it might be women, it might be men, it might be a particular race or a particular nation, because everybody, sadly, has prejudices. All of us have prejudices. There's no one out there without prejudices, and it would be much nicer if everybody admitted that sometimes. But these crackpot prejudices of Bunny's, now you probably noticed that Bunny has bad things to say about homosexuals, about women, about Jews, and so these are crackpot prejudices of Bunny's, were not remotely ironic, but deadly serious. Notice the adverb collocation, yeah, not adverb collocation, but adverb collocation. That is very parallel, yeah, because not and but are correlative conjunctions, yeah, and so not adverb collocation, but adverb collocation. It sounds nice, and yet not remotely ironic. We use this remotely, certainly with ironic. Yeah, they were not remotely ironic, so they weren't ironic in any way. That's what not remotely ironic means. They weren't ironic in any way, but they were deadly serious. And so Richard is claiming, and I don't know if you want to believe Richard or not, because of course Richard is an unreliable narrator. Richard is, no doubt about it, he is trying to justify the murder of Bunny. And so when Richard tells you that these crackpot prejudices of Bunny's were not remotely ironic but deadly serious, he might be saying this because he wants you to believe that he killed Bunny for good reasons. Yeah, and so be careful with how much you believe of what Richard says in chapter 5. I think you should always take everything he says with a pinch of salt, we say. Take everything he says with a pinch of salt, which means don't believe everything he says. Start to question some of the claims that he makes, in particular about Bunny, because he makes a lot of claims about Bunny in this chapter. And maybe this isn't true. Maybe Bunny's prejudices against women, against Jews, against homosexuals are actually ironic rather than deadly serious. Who knows? Okay?